I'm Angie Henderson, 30 years old, and I built a solid career from the ground up while quietly carrying my family's burdens. For years, I paid their bills, fixed their problems, and laughed off their jokes at my expense just to keep the peace. But when my own father stood at my wedding and toasted me as his useless daughter, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been humiliated by someone you gave everything to? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being written off, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries, self-respect, and unexpected turning points. What happened after that toast might surprise you. Growing up in the Henderson house meant walking on eggshells that never quite stayed intact. My father had this way of making you feel like you were perpetually failing some test you didn't know you were taking. The rules changed without warning, and the goalposts moved just when you thought you might actually reach them. Still, I kept trying. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was hope, but I spent most of my childhood and all of my 20s believing that if I just worked hard enough, gave enough, proved myself sufficiently, he'd finally see me as worthy. The evidence suggested otherwise, but I ignored it. When I graduated summa cum laude from college, he mentioned that my cousin had gotten into medical school. When I landed my first real job, he wondered why I hadn't aimed higher. When I bought my first apartment, he questioned whether I could afford the mortgage. Every achievement came with a qualifier, every success with a subtle undermining. My mother would smooth things over later, explaining that he meant well, that he just wanted me to reach my potential. I believed her because I needed to. The financial help started small. A few hundred here and there when they were short on rent. I was young, working entry-level, but I had savings and they seemed desperate. Dad would call with that particular tone in his voice, the one that managed to be both commanding and pitiful. "We're in a tight spot, kiddo. You know how it is." I knew how it was. I also knew that asking anyone else in the family wasn't an option, though I never questioned why that was. I just transferred the money and felt useful, needed, important in some way that grades and jobs hadn't managed to make me feel. The requests grew larger over the years. Car repairs that cost thousands. Medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover. A roof that needed replacing. Emergency after emergency, each one presented as temporary, each one repaid with gratitude that felt genuine enough to keep me writing checks. I started budgeting around their crises, keeping a cushion in my savings account that wasn't really mine. When friends suggested weekend trips or dinners I couldn't afford, I'd make excuses rather than explain that my money was spoken for by problems I couldn't discuss. My siblings knew, of course. They had to. But Sarah was in graduate school, drowning in her own debt, and Mom always said we couldn't ask her to sacrifice her future. Marcus had just gotten married and bought a house, and everyone agreed he needed to focus on his new family. Somehow, being single meant being available, being stable meant being responsible for everyone else's instability. The logic was never stated outright, but it didn't need to be. I understood my role. The pattern extended beyond money. When Dad needed help moving offices, I took vacation days. When he wanted someone to drive him to medical appointments, I rearranged my schedule. When family gatherings needed organizing, the planning fell to me. I told myself this was what families did, what love looked like in practice. I told myself that someday, when I needed help, they'd be there for me too. I told myself a lot of things that made the imbalance easier to swallow. But even as I gave and gave, his comments continued. At family dinners, he'd make little observations that felt like paper cuts. "She's not the organized one in the family," he'd say when someone complimented a party I'd planned. "She tries hard, but she's not naturally good with people like Sarah." These weren't cruel observations, exactly, just casual diminishments that left me wondering if I'd imagined the sting. When I'd bring it up later, he'd seem genuinely confused. I was just being honest. You know I believe in telling the truth. As if honesty justified anything, as if truth were some immutable force rather than a choice about which facts to emphasize and which to let slide. The worst part was how normal it all became. My friends would compliment my family, talk about how lucky I was to have such a close relationship with my parents. From the outside, it probably did look enviable. We talked regularly, saw each other often, helped each other out. What they couldn't see was the careful choreography of it all, the way I'd learned to anticipate his moods, deflect his criticisms, absorb his disappointments without letting them show on my face. I became an expert at managing his emotions while neglecting my own. When I met David, I tried to explain the dynamics without sounding like I was complaining. He was a military man, straightforward and direct in ways that made my family's subtle manipulations feel even more twisted by comparison. He noticed things I'd stopped seeing, patterns I'd learned to accept as natural law. "Why do you always pay for dinner when we go out with them?" he'd ask, or "Did you notice how he changed the subject when you mentioned your promotion?" These weren't accusations, just observations, but they made me see our interactions differently. David's own family was complicated in different ways, but the respect was automatic and mutual. His parents might disagree with his choices, might worry about his career or his safety, but they never questioned his fundamental worth as a person. Watching him interact with them showed me what unconditional love actually looked like, how different it was from the performance-based affection I'd grown up thinking was normal. It wasn't that they didn't have expectations or standards, it was that their love didn't depend on meeting them. Still, I couldn't imagine cutting ties completely. Despite everything, these were my people. My father had taught me to drive, had come to my school plays, had been there for moments that mattered. The good memories were real, even if they came with conditions I was only beginning to understand. I thought marriage might change things, might give me enough distance to renegotiate the terms of our relationship. I thought maybe becoming Mrs. David Chin would elevate me in his eyes, make him see me as an adult worthy of respect rather than a perpetual child in need of correction. I should have known better. The signs were all there, had been there for years. But hope is stubborn and family loyalty is a hard habit to break. So I planned a wedding and invited them all, still believing that love would eventually win out over everything else. Still believing that this time, finally, would be different. The morning of my wedding, I woke up with butterflies that had nothing to do with David. I was nervous about seeing my father in his tuxedo, about whether he'd be proud of me walking down the aisle, about whether his speech would finally acknowledge all the ways I'd tried to be a good daughter. I was still hoping for magic, still believing in fairy tale endings where love conquers all and families learn to see each other clearly. I had no idea that by the end of the night, I'd stop hoping for either. As I got older, his remarks grew sharper and more public. What had once been private criticisms became performance pieces for family gatherings, little comedy routines where I played the incompetent daughter and everyone else got to laugh along. The jokes followed predictable patterns. If someone mentioned a complex task, Dad would chuckle and say, "Well, we won't ask her to handle that." If a conversation turned to successful careers, he'd pat my shoulder and add, "She does her best, bless her heart." The laughter always came easily from my siblings and their spouses, from cousins and aunts who were probably just relieved not to be the target. I learned to smile on cue, to play along with the routine. Pushing back only made things worse, turned me into the family member who couldn't take a joke, who was too sensitive for her own good. So I developed a repertoire of self-deprecating responses, ways to deflect the sting by getting there first. "You know me, hopeless as always," I'd say, laughing along with everyone else while something inside me curled up tight. It became second nature, this performance of inadequacy, until I almost believed it myself. Sarah and Marcus never defended me during these moments, but they didn't initiate them either. They'd laugh when Dad started his routine, but quietly, uncomfortably, like they knew it wasn't quite right but couldn't figure out how to make it stop. Later, in private moments, they'd be kind to me, normal, which made the public humiliations feel even more surreal. It was as if we were all playing roles during family gatherings, reading from a script that none of us remembered writing. The worst incidents happened at larger gatherings, weddings, and holiday parties where the audience was bigger and Dad's performance more elaborate. He seemed to feed off the attention, the way people would lean in to hear what amusing thing he'd say about his bumbling daughter next. I began dreading these events, making excuses to arrive late or leave early, anything to minimize my exposure to the comedy hour. But missing family events entirely wasn't an option, not if I wanted to maintain any relationship with the rest of them. David noticed the pattern immediately, though he was careful not to comment at first. I could see him watching during family dinners, his jaw tightening when Dad would launch into one of his routines. Military training had taught him to observe before acting, to gather intelligence before making tactical decisions. After a few gatherings, he started asking gentle questions. Does he always talk about you like that, or how long has this been going on? The questions made me defensive at first. I'd make excuses, explain that it was just Dad's sense of humor, that he didn't mean anything by it. But David's questions planted seeds that grew uncomfortable in my mind. I started noticing things I'd trained myself to ignore, patterns that had become invisible through repetition. How Dad never told stories that cast me in a positive light. How he'd interrupt me during conversations to correct details that didn't need correcting. How he'd volunteer me for tasks he assumed I couldn't handle properly, setting me up for either failure or backhanded compliments about exceeding expectations. The observations accumulated like evidence in a case I hadn't realized I was building. The financial requests continued throughout this period, maybe even intensified. It was as if playing the role of family disappointment made me more useful somehow, more obligated to prove my worth through practical contributions. Dad would call with emergencies that needed immediate attention, problems that only cash could solve. The conversations always started with affection. Hi kiddo, how's my girl? Before transitioning into crisis mode. I'd find myself agreeing to help before fully understanding what I was agreeing to, caught up in the urgency of whatever disaster needed averting. David didn't understand the financial arrangement, couldn't see why my parents' emergencies were automatically my responsibilities. He'd point out that Sarah and Marcus were never asked to contribute, that my parents seemed remarkably capable of managing their finances except when they needed money from me. His observations stung because they were accurate, but I couldn't admit that without admitting I'd been played for a fool for years. Instead, I'd explain about family loyalty, about being in a position to help when others couldn't. I'd make it sound noble instead of pathetic, generous instead of compulsive. The cognitive dissonance became harder to maintain as the wedding approached. I was planning to promise to love and honor David while simultaneously allowing my family to dishonor me in ways I was just beginning to recognize. I was asking him to become part of a family system that treated me like a convenient target, expecting him to smile along with jokes that diminished his future wife. The contradictions were becoming impossible to ignore, but I still couldn't imagine confronting them directly. Instead, I did what I'd always done. I hoped things would change naturally. Maybe marriage would shift the dynamic, force Dad to see me differently. Maybe having an accomplished military officer as a son-in-law would reflect well enough on me to earn some respect by association. Maybe the formality of a wedding, the gravity of the occasion, would inspire him to set aside the comedy routine for one night and speak about me with genuine pride. I was still operating under the assumption that love would eventually triumph over habit, that family bonds would prove stronger than entrenched patterns of disrespect. The wedding planning process should have been a warning. Dad had opinions about everything, the venue, the menu, the guest list, but never asked about my preferences or acknowledged the work I was putting into making decisions. He'd call with suggestions that were actually demands, critiques disguised as helpful observations. When I'd mention being stressed about details, he'd laugh and say something like, "Well, you wanted a fancy wedding," as if the complexity were my fault rather than an inevitable result of trying to bring two families together for a celebration. Even then, even with all the evidence mounting, I kept believing that the day itself would be different. That when he saw me in my dress, when he walked me down the aisle, when the moment came for him to speak publicly about his daughter on her wedding day, something in him would shift. Love would win. Pride would overcome habit. The daughter he'd raised, the one who'd supported and helped and tried so hard for so many years, would finally be seen and acknowledged. I was wrong about almost everything, but I was especially wrong about that. My wedding day arrived with the kind of California sunshine that makes everything look like a movie set. The venue was perfect, the flowers exactly what I'd envisioned, the dress a dream I'd been saving for since I was 25. David looked impossibly handsome in his dress uniform, medals catching the light as he straightened his tie in the mirror. For a few hours that morning, Everything felt magical and right, like all the planning and stress had been worth it for this one perfect day. My father seemed different that morning too, more tender than usual. He helped my mother with her corsage, complimented the bridesmaids' dresses, even told me I looked beautiful without any qualifying remarks. I thought maybe the gravity of the occasion had reached him, that he understood this was a day for celebration rather than performance. When he offered me his arm to walk down the aisle, his smile seemed genuine, proud even. For those few minutes, I felt like the daughter I'd always wanted to be. The ceremony was everything I'd hoped for. David's vows made me cry happy tears, and I managed to get through mine without stumbling over the words I'd practiced for weeks. Our families beamed from their seats, cameras flashing, everyone caught up in the romance and joy of the moment. When the pastor pronounced us husband and wife, the cheers were loud and heartfelt. I felt surrounded by love, supported by people who wanted nothing but happiness for us. It was the kind of moment you want to freeze forever, when everything feels possible and right with the world. The reception continued in the same spirit. Dinner was delicious, the band played all our favorite songs, and the dance floor filled up as soon as the music started. David's military friends told embarrassing stories about his academy days, and my college roommates shared memories that made everyone laugh. It felt like a real celebration, a gathering of people who genuinely cared about us and wanted to mark this important transition in our lives. I started to relax for the first time in months, finally able to enjoy the party I'd worked so hard to create. Then came the toasts. David's father spoke first, welcoming me into their family with words that made me feel seen and valued. My maid of honor shared funny stories about our friendship that had everyone smiling. Marcus raised his glass to wish us happiness and success, brief but sincere. Everything was going exactly as planned, exactly as I'd hoped. The evening felt charmed, blessed, perfect in every way that mattered. When my father stood up with his glass, I felt a flutter of anticipation mixed with anxiety. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, hoping for, the chance for him to publicly acknowledge me with pride instead of amusement. The room quieted down, everyone turning to listen to what the bride's father would say. He cleared his throat, smiled at the crowd, and began to speak. "I'd like to propose a toast," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room. I held my breath, ready to finally hear the words I'd been waiting for my entire life. "To my useless daughter." The words hit like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making my vision blur around the edges. For a split second, I thought I'd misheard, that the acoustics had somehow twisted his words into something cruel and impossible. But the laughter that followed confirmed it. People actually laughed. Cameras flashed. Someone whistled appreciatively, as if he delivered a particularly clever punchline. My face burned with humiliation so complete and devastating that I couldn't even process it fully. I just sat there, frozen in my wedding dress, while my worst fears played out in front of everyone who mattered to me. The laughter seemed to go on forever, though it probably lasted only seconds. I could hear my mother's nervous giggle, Sarah's uncomfortable chuckle, the hearty guffaws of uncles and cousins who thought they were witnessing harmless family teasing. Only David's family sat in stunned silence, their faces reflecting the shock I was too paralyzed to show. I wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor of the beautiful venue and never face any of these people again. Instead, I sat motionless in my chair, my hands clenched in my lap, while everything I'd hoped for crumbled around me. My father continued speaking, but I couldn't hear the words over the roaring in my ears. He was probably adding context now, softening the blow with affectionate qualifiers, but it was too late. The damage was done, the moment ruined, the fairy tale ending I'd been hoping for transformed into a nightmare I'd remember forever. On what should have been the happiest day of my life, in front of everyone I loved, he'd reduced me to a punchline one final time. And people had laughed. That might have been the worst part of all, that they thought it was funny. I barely remember what happened immediately after the toast ended. My mind went somewhere else, somewhere safe and distant where words couldn't reach me. I know people came up to congratulate us, that the band started playing again, that life continued as if nothing devastating had just occurred. I must have smiled and thanked them, must have pretended everything was fine, because no one seemed to notice that I'd essentially died inside during my father's speech. The show went on, as shows always do, while I learned what it felt like to have your heart broken by someone who was supposed to love you unconditionally. Later, while everyone else danced and celebrated, I found myself sitting alone at our sweetheart table, staring at my untouched cake and trying to understand what had just happened. Years of small humiliations had led to this moment, this public execution of my dignity on what should have been my most special day. I thought about all the money I'd given them, all the favors I'd done, all the times I'd swallowed his criticisms and smiled through his jokes. I thought about how I'd convinced myself it was love, how I'd made excuses for behavior that no one should have to tolerate from anyone, much less from a parent. For the first time in my life, I asked myself why I kept accepting this treatment. What was I getting out of this relationship that made the pain worth enduring? What exactly was I so afraid of losing that I'd allowed myself to be diminished over and over again? The questions hurt almost as much as his words had, because they forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding for decades. I wasn't just a victim of his cruelty. I was a collaborator in it, an enabler who'd taught him that I would accept anything he chose to dish out. The realization was devastating and liberating at the same time. Devastating because it meant accepting responsibility for my own suffering, admitting that I'd chosen this dynamic as much as he had. But liberating because choice meant agency, and agency meant the possibility of change. For the first time, I understood that I didn't have to keep playing this role, didn't have to keep hoping he'd suddenly transform into the father I'd always wanted. I could choose differently. I could choose myself. The moment David set his glass down, everything changed. Not just the sound, though that was dramatic enough, the sharp clink of crystal against wood cutting through the laughter like a blade, but the entire energy of the room. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People turned to look. Even the band seemed to sense something shifting, their music trailing off into uncertain silence. In that quiet space, my husband's voice carried with absolute clarity and unmistakable authority. "You don't get to talk about my wife like that." His words were measured, controlled, but there was steel underneath that made everyone in the room understand this wasn't a joke or a playful pushback. This was a line being drawn, a boundary being established by someone who clearly had no intention of backing down. David didn't raise his voice. His military training had taught him that real authority didn't need volume, but every syllable carried the weight of absolute conviction. He was defending his wife, and he was doing it publicly, in front of everyone who'd just laughed at her expense. My father's face went through a series of rapid changes. Surprise first, then confusion, then a kind of nervous anger that suggested he wasn't used to being challenged so directly. He tried to recover with a laugh, the same dismissive chuckle he'd used to deflect criticism for years. "Come on, David, you know I'm just kidding around. She knows I don't mean anything by it." But his voice sounded thin and uncertain, like he was testing the waters of a situation he didn't quite understand. The easy confidence of moments before had evaporated entirely. David didn't smile back. He didn't soften his expression or give my father an easy way out of the confrontation. Instead, he stood up slowly, his full height and military bearing making him an imposing presence even in formal wear. "No," he said simply. "That's not how this works anymore." The finality in his tone left no room for argument, no space for the kind of manipulative backtracking my father usually employed when someone questioned his behavior. This was happening whether he liked it or not. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced at a family gathering. Usually, someone would rush to smooth over any tension, to make jokes or change the subject until everyone could pretend the uncomfortable moment had never occurred. But nobody moved to rescue my father this time. My mother sat frozen in her chair, probably as shocked by the confrontation as everyone else. Sarah and Marcus looked everywhere except at the main players in this drama. Even the extended family members, the ones who usually found Dad's routines so amusing, seemed unsure how to react. For the first time in my memory, my father was the one who looked small. Without an audience laughing along with his jokes, without the safety of established family dynamics to hide behind, he seemed diminished somehow. Older. less certain of his place in the world. He tried to regain control by appealing to the crowd, spreading his hands in a "can you believe this guy?" gesture that fell completely flat. "It's just family teasing," he said to the room in general. "We've always been this way. She understands." But nobody laughed this time. Nobody nodded in agreement. Nobody came to his rescue. I realized I was holding my breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Part of me was terrified. This kind of direct confrontation was exactly what I'd spent years trying to avoid. But another part, a part I'd kept buried for so long I'd almost forgotten it existed, felt something I barely recognized. Relief. Someone had finally said what I'd never been able to say myself. Someone had finally stood up to him on my behalf. Someone had seen the cruelty for what it was and refused to pretend it was acceptable. David wasn't finished. He walked around the table until he was standing directly behind my chair, his hands resting gently on my shoulders in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. The message was clear: she's mine now, and I don't accept the way you've been treating her. "I've watched you do this for months," he said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that made everyone in the room pay attention. "The little comments, the jokes at her expense, the way you make her feel like she has to apologize for existing. It stops now." My father's face flushed red, and for a moment I thought he might explode into one of his rages. But something about David's bearing, his absolute composure in the face of what should have been overwhelming social pressure, seemed to deflate him instead. Maybe it was recognizing another alpha male, someone who wouldn't be intimidated by bluster or manipulation. Maybe it was simply the shock of being called out so directly, so publicly. Whatever it was, he didn't fight back the way I'd expected him to. Instead, he tried a different approach, one I'd seen him use when his usual tactics failed. He softened his voice, put on his most reasonable expression, and tried to make David the unreasonable one. "Look, son, I think you're overreacting. This is just how our family is. We tease each other. It's affectionate." But even as he spoke, his eyes kept darting around the room, looking for support that wasn't materializing. The other guests were watching this unfold like a tennis match, their heads turning between the two men, but their expressions remaining carefully neutral. "Affection doesn't require an audience," David replied. "And it doesn't leave the person feeling worthless." His hands tightened slightly on my shoulders, a subtle reminder that he was there, that I wasn't facing this alone anymore. "I've seen real affection, sir. This isn't it." The "sir" was perfectly polite, but it carried just enough military formality to remind everyone in the room that David knew something about respect, about hierarchy, about the difference between legitimate authority and bullying disguised as humor. The standoff continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. My father opened and closed his mouth several times, clearly struggling to find a response that would let him save face without backing down completely. The room remained silent except for the distant sound of traffic and the nervous rustling of formal whereas people shifted in their chairs. I could feel the weight of everyone's attention, but for once it wasn't focused on my inadequacies. For once, someone else was being held accountable for their behavior. Finally, my father did something I'd never seen him do before. He sat down. Not gracefully or strategically, but heavily, like a man who'd suddenly realized he was outnumbered and outgunned. He picked up his wine glass with hands that trembled slightly, took a long sip, and stared down at the table. The fight had gone out of him, at least for now. He looked older than his years, deflated in a way that was almost pitiable. Almost. David remained standing for another moment, making sure the lesson had been received and understood by everyone present. Then he leaned down and whispered something in my ear. "Are you okay?" Before taking his seat beside me. His hand found mine under the table, squeezing gently in a gesture of support that grounded me back in the present moment. The crisis was over, at least the immediate one. But I knew that everything had changed, that the balance of power in my family had shifted permanently and irrevocably. Slowly, conversation began to resume around the room. People started talking to their neighbors again, though the topics seemed carefully chosen to avoid anything controversial. The band, reading the room with professional skill, launched into an upbeat song that encouraged people to return to the dance floor. Life was gradually returning to normal, or at least the appearance of normal. But I knew that nothing would ever be quite the same. Someone had finally called out the family emperor for having no clothes, and we couldn't pretend we hadn't all seen him naked. In the months that followed my wedding, I discovered what life looked like when I stopped being the family's designated problem solver. It was quieter than I'd expected, lonelier in some ways, but also cleaner somehow. Without the constant drama of other people's emergencies, I had space to think, to breathe, to remember who I was when I wasn't performing the role of dutiful daughter or convenient scapegoat. The silence felt strange at first, like walking into a house where the air conditioning has finally stopped running and you realize how long you've been living with that constant background noise. The phone calls were the first thing to change. Where once my father would call several times a week with updates on family news, requests for favors, or problems that needed my immediate attention, now days would pass without hearing from him. When he did call, the conversations were stilted and brief, neither of us quite sure how to navigate this new dynamic where I wasn't automatically available for whatever he needed. He seemed to be waiting for me to go back to normal, to pretend the wedding incident had never happened and resume my traditional role as the family's unpaid crisis management service. But I couldn't go back. David's defense had cracked something open in me, some protective shell I'd built around the truth of my situation. Without that shell, I could see clearly for the first time how much of my life had been consumed by managing other people's problems while ignoring my own needs. I started noticing things I'd trained myself not to see: how exhausted I felt after family phone calls, how anxious I got when their number showed up on my caller ID, how much mental energy I spent trying to anticipate and prevent their next crisis. The financial requests were harder to decline than I'd expected. Years of conditioning don't disappear overnight, and guilt is a stubborn emotion to shake. When Dad called about a car repair that insurance wouldn't cover, my first instinct was to ask how much he needed and when he needed it by. But David's presence in my life had given me something I'd never had before: a witness to these interactions who could see them clearly without the distorting lens of family obligation. "You don't owe them money," he'd remind me when I wavered. "You don't owe them anything." Sarah and Marcus seemed confused by the change in family dynamics. They'd grown used to me being the reliable one, the sister who could be counted on to handle whatever parental crisis emerged. When they called looking for updates on Dad's latest drama or expecting me to coordinate family events, they found me strangely unavailable. I wasn't hostile or dramatic about it, I just wasn't there the way I used to be. I stopped being the family's central communication hub, the person everyone called first when they needed information or assistance or someone to vent to about the others. The most difficult part was learning to sit with other people's disappointment without rushing to fix it. Dad would call with problems that would have once sent me into immediate problem-solving mode, and I'd have to consciously resist the urge to step in. When he mentioned being behind on bills, I offered emotional support instead of financial assistance. When he needed help with complicated paperwork, I suggested he hire someone rather than volunteering my weekend. The conversations often ended awkwardly, with long silences where his expectation of my help bumped up against my new boundaries. Some family members tried to guilt me back into my old role. "He's getting older," my mother would say when I declined to handle some task that Dad couldn't manage alone. "You know how he is. It's just easier if you take care of it." But easier for whom? I was beginning to understand that my convenience had always been sacrificed for everyone else's, that easier usually meant easier for them while being much harder for me. I started asking questions that made people uncomfortable. Why can't Marcus help with this? Why is this automatically my responsibility? What happened before I was available to handle these things? The questions revealed cracks in the family narrative that had sustained my role as the designated helper. It turned out that many of their emergencies were actually predictable consequences of poor planning or irresponsible behavior. The financial crises often coincided with unnecessary purchases or expensive vacations that somehow hadn't been mentioned when they were asking for money. The urgent deadlines were frequently the result of procrastination or disorganization that could have been avoided with basic adult planning skills. Without me rushing in to solve every problem, some interesting patterns emerged. Marcus and Sarah started getting calls they'd never received before, requests for help that had previously been routed automatically to me. They discovered what it felt like to be the family's first choice for difficult conversations, inconvenient favors, and emergency assistance. Some of them rose to the occasion admirably. Others suddenly became very busy whenever their phones rang. The distribution of family labor began to equalize in ways that revealed how unbalanced it had been before. Dad's reaction to these changes was complex and sometimes concerning. Without my constant support propping up his image, his shortcomings became more visible to the rest of the family. The charming, slightly helpless father figure who needed his capable daughter's assistance was revealed to be someone whose problems were often self-created and whose helplessness was somewhat selective. Family gatherings became tenser as people witnessed behavior they'd previously only heard about secondhand, filtered through my diplomatic reporting. The most surprising development was how much energy I had once I stopped spending it all on family management. Projects I'd put off for years suddenly seemed manageable. Hobbies I'd abandoned due to lack of time reappeared in my schedule. David and I could make weekend plans without me having to check first whether any family crises needed my attention. I started sleeping better, worrying less, feeling like my life belonged to me again instead of being borrowed indefinitely by people who couldn't manage their own affairs. But the transition wasn't without cost. Some relationships were damaged, possibly permanently. Extended family members who'd grown used to my organizational skills and conflict management abilities began excluding me from events I'd previously helped plan. Cousins who'd relied on me for regular updates about family news found other sources or simply stayed less informed. The family ecosystem had to reorganize itself around my absence, and not everyone was happy about the adjustments required. The hardest part was accepting that some bridges might be burned forever. People who'd benefited from my constant availability weren't necessarily going to respect my decision to step back, and they weren't going to thank me for the years of service I'd provided. Some of them seemed to view my new boundaries as selfishness, my refusal to continue enabling their dysfunction as betrayal. They wanted the old me back, the one who absorbed criticism gracefully, who solved problems without complaining, who could be counted on to sacrifice her own needs for the greater family good. That version of myself was gone, and she wasn't coming back. The woman who emerged from my wedding night was stronger, clearer, more protective of her own interests. She still cared about family, but she learned the difference between caring and caretaking, between love and enabling. She was learning to distinguish between relationships that nourished her and ones that merely consumed her energy. It was painful education, but it was long overdue. For the first time in my adult life, I was discovering who I was when I wasn't performing the role others had assigned me. My father's attempts to reach out began about 6 months after the wedding, right around the time when the family crisis management system I'd anchored for so many years started showing signs of serious strain. The calls came sporadically at first, awkward check-ins where he'd ask how I was doing with the careful tone of someone testing the temperature of water they're not sure they want to enter. I could hear the effort in his voice, the unfamiliar sound of someone who was used to making demands learning to make requests instead. The first real conversation came on a Tuesday evening in November. David was working late, and I was reading in our living room when the phone rang. Dad's voice sounded older somehow, less certain than I remembered. "I was wondering if you might want to have dinner sometime," he said, without the usual preamble of crisis or complaint. "Just the two of us. I thought we could talk." The invitation was so unprecedented that I almost didn't know how to respond. In 30 years of being his daughter, I couldn't remember him ever asking to spend time with me for its own sake. I agreed to meet him, though I insisted on choosing the restaurant and made it clear that I had plans afterward that couldn't be changed. Small boundaries, but important ones. I needed him to understand that any relationship we rebuilt would be on different terms than the one we'd had before. The dinner was strange and stilted, like two people who'd never quite learned how to talk to each other trying to figure it out for the first time. He asked about my job, my marriage, my life in general, but his questions felt rehearsed, like he'd prepared a list beforehand of appropriate topics for father-daughter conversations. I answered politely, but without the eager-to-please energy that had characterized our interactions for decades. I was pleasant but not accommodating, present but not available in the way I used to be. About halfway through the meal, he cleared his throat and said, "I know things have been different since the wedding." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was closer to acknowledgement than I'd ever gotten from him before. I didn't realize. He started, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words that didn't come naturally to him. "I suppose I didn't think about how some of the things I said might sound to you." The passive voice was telling. Even in this moment of attempted reconciliation, he couldn't quite take full responsibility for his choices. I didn't make it easy for him. The old me would have rushed to reassure him, to minimize the damage and smooth over the awkwardness so we could all pretend everything was fine. But the new me sat quietly and waited for him to finish his thought. If he wanted forgiveness, he was going to have to actually ask for it. If he wanted a relationship with me, he was going to have to explain what that relationship would look like and why I should want to participate in it. The silence stretched between us until he tried again. "Your husband," he said carefully, "he made some valid points that night. About respect. About how families should treat each other." It was progress, I suppose, though calling David your husband instead of using his name suggested that he still saw him as an interloper rather than a permanent part of my life. Still, acknowledging that David had been right about anything was a significant concession from someone who rarely admitted error. I waited for more, but that seemed to be the extent of his prepared remarks. When it became clear that I wasn't going to fill the awkward silence with gracious acceptance, he shifted uncomfortably in his chair and tried a different approach. "I miss talking to you," he said, and for the first time that evening, his words sounded completely genuine. "I miss knowing what's going on in your life. I miss having you involved in family things." The admission surprised me with its honesty, but it also revealed how little he understood about why our relationship had changed. "You can know what's going on in my life," I told him. "But the way you learn about it has to be different. You can't call me every week with some crisis and then act like I'm unreasonable for not dropping everything to fix it. You can't make jokes about me being incompetent and expect me to laugh along. You can't treat me like I exist primarily to make your life easier and then be surprised when I stop being available for that role." He listened without interrupting, which was itself a departure from our usual dynamic. When I finished, he nodded slowly, like he was processing information that was both surprising and somehow expected. "I suppose I did rely on you quite a bit," he said finally. "Maybe more than was fair." Again, the careful language that acknowledged the effect without quite admitting intentional harm. But it was something, a recognition that our previous relationship had been imbalanced in ways that weren't sustainable. We agreed to try having monthly dinners, structured conversations where we could rebuild our relationship on more equal terms. He would update me on family news without expecting me to solve family problems. I would share what I was comfortable sharing about my life without feeling obligated to provide unlimited emotional labor in return. It wasn't warm or easy, but it was honest in a way our interactions had never been before. The arrangement worked better than I'd expected, though it took time for both of us to learn the new rules. He'd occasionally slip back into old patterns, starting to describe some crisis with the expectation that I'd offer to help, then catching himself when he saw my expression. I had to learn to enforce my boundaries without being defensive, to state my limits clearly without lengthy justifications that invited argument. It was like learning a new language that we were both speaking imperfectly, but with gradually improving fluency. Other family relationships remained more complicated. My mother struggled with the changed dynamic, caught between loyalty to her husband and recognition that I'd been treated unfairly for years. She wanted peace more than justice, which meant pressuring me to be more accommodating rather than expecting him to be more respectful. Sarah and Marcus were adapting to having actual responsibilities in family crisis management, discovering how exhausting it could be to field every panicked phone call and urgent request for assistance. Some extended family members never adjusted to the new reality. Cousins who'd grown used to my organizational skills and conflict resolution abilities began leaving me out of family events rather than dealing with the inconvenience of planning things themselves. Aunts and uncles who'd enjoyed watching Dad's comedy routine at my expense seemed less interested in family gatherings where the entertainment value was reduced. The family ecosystem was reorganizing itself around different assumptions about who was available for what kinds of emotional and practical labor. But there were unexpected benefits to the new arrangement as well. Without the constant undercurrent of tension and resentment that had characterized our previous relationship, Dad and I could have conversations about topics we'd never explored before. He told me stories about his childhood that helped me understand some of his patterns without excusing them. I shared thoughts about my career and my marriage without fear that they'd be turned into ammunition for future criticism. We were getting to know each other as adults, maybe for the first time. The process was slow and sometimes frustrating. There were setbacks, moments when one of us would revert to old habits, and we'd have to negotiate our way back to neutral ground. But there was also genuine progress, a growing sense that we could have a relationship based on mutual respect rather than established hierarchy. It wasn't the father-daughter dynamic I'd dreamed of as a child, but it was real and sustainable in a way our previous arrangement never could have been. Most importantly, I learned that I could love my family without sacrificing myself for them, that boundaries weren't barriers to relationship, but prerequisites for healthy ones. The woman who emerged from this process was someone I barely recognized, but thoroughly approved of, someone who could care deeply about others without losing herself in their problems, someone who could be generous without being exploitative, someone who understood that real love requires respect and respect requires limits. It had taken 30 years and a public humiliation at my own wedding to learn these lessons, but better late than never. Today, almost 3 years after that devastating toast, I can look back on my wedding night as the beginning of something important rather than just the end of something painful. Not because the humiliation was worth it, it wasn't, but because it finally forced a reckoning that was long overdue. David's intervention didn't just protect me in that moment, it showed me what protection looked like, what it felt like to have someone refuse to let you be diminished. More importantly, it taught me that I deserved that kind of protection and that I could provide it for myself. The relationship I have with my father now isn't perfect, but it's honest. We see each other monthly, usually for dinner, sometimes for family events where we both understand the boundaries that govern our interaction. He doesn't call me with crises anymore, and I don't offer solutions to problems he hasn't asked me to solve. We talk about books, about current events, about his grandchildren when Marcus and Sarah bring them around. The conversations are careful but genuine, built on mutual respect rather than established patterns of dysfunction. He's never apologized directly for that toast or for the years of subtle cruelty that preceded it. I don't think he's capable of that kind of complete accountability, and I've made peace with that limitation. What matters more is that the behavior has changed, that he's learned to interact with me as an adult worthy of consideration rather than a convenient target for his frustrations. The relationship we have now is smaller than what I once hoped for, but it's also cleaner, more sustainable, more real. My marriage to David grew stronger through this process, deepened by the knowledge that he would stand up for me when I couldn't stand up for myself, broadened by the trust that comes from surviving conflict together. He taught me what it looked like to have someone in your corner unconditionally, not because you'd earned it through perfect behavior, but because you deserved it simply by existing. That lesson changed everything about how I understood relationships, family, love itself. The other family relationships found their own new equilibriums. Sarah and I are closer now, bonded by her growing understanding of what it was like to be Dad's primary emotional support system. Marcus struggled more with the changes, resistant to taking on responsibilities he'd never had to shoulder before, but even he eventually adapted. My mother remains caught in the middle, but she's learned to navigate family dynamics without expecting me to sacrifice my own well-being for everyone else's comfort. The extended family mostly adjusted or drifted away, depending on how much they valued the relationships versus the convenience of my previous role. Some cousins and aunts who'd relied on my organizational skills found other ways to coordinate family events, or simply had smaller, less elaborate gatherings. Others discovered they enjoyed more intimate celebrations that didn't require extensive planning and management. The family continued to function, just differently. What I gained in this process was something I'd never had before, a clear sense of my own worth that didn't depend on other people's validation or approval. For 30 years, I'd measured my value by how useful I could be to others, how much I could give, how many problems I could solve. Now I know that my worth exists independently of my utility, that I deserve respect and consideration simply because I'm a human being worthy of dignity. That knowledge is armor against manipulation, protection against people who would exploit my generosity or mistake my kindness for weakness. The woman who sits in that wedding photo, frozen in humiliation while cameras flashed around her, learned something crucial that night. She didn't have to accept being diminished by anyone, not even family, not even people she loved. She learned that dignity isn't granted by others, but claimed by refusing to surrender it. She learned that real love requires respect, and respect requires boundaries, and boundaries are not walls, but foundations for relationships built to last. The toast that was meant to diminish me ultimately liberated me. The public humiliation that should have been my lowest moment became the catalyst for the most important growth of my adult life. I wouldn't choose to relive that night, wouldn't wish that kind of pain on anyone, but I can't pretend I'm not grateful for where it led me. Sometimes the worst moments teach us the most important lessons. Sometimes we have to lose everything we thought we wanted to find what we actually needed. Sometimes love looks like a glass being set down firmly enough to cut through years of laughter and silence, a room full of people who needed to hear an uncomfortable truth. My father raised his glass that night to toast his useless daughter. What he didn't realize was that he was actually toasting the end of his usefulness to me, the conclusion of a dynamic that had sustained him at my expense for decades. The daughter he thought he was dismissing was already gone, replaced by a woman who knew her worth and wouldn't settle for less than she deserved. The joke was on him in the end. He just never understood the punchline. That night taught me something simple but life-changing. Respect isn't given by family just because they're family, it's earned, and it's also demanded. Have you ever had to draw a line with someone close to you? Did they fight it, or did they finally listen? Let me know in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story resonated with you, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it today.